Anyway, thank you so much, all of you, for coming on, old friends and new, from very many different places, one of which was going to be from New Zealand, but unfortunately he has just got in touch with us to say he can't come. Do you want to, you're recording already, aren't you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening. For those who don't know, my name is Alistair Chapman. I'm the chairman of the Wellington Trust. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to lecture by our good friend John Johnson Allen. Somebody who's actually not been, I wonder if they could very kindly,
The health secretary, Matt Hancock, said the mutation
yeah, we've got the news
responsible
coming
for a
on.
faster spread of the
Thank you very much.
disease.
If someone
It
could
was
mute
identified
that,
in around 1,000 patients in southern England, but it's got a vaccine.
Somebody's not muted and they've got.
there we are. That's better. Good. Thank you very much indeed. It is good to welcome John Johnson Allen. I will tell you a little bit more about in a moment, who is a liveryman of the Honourable Company. And if you could give me one more slide, please, Jenny, down from there. Just a few housekeeping notes before I properly introduce John for this evening's lecture, which I can tell you will be enthralling. We had a preview of this the other day. As a matter of housekeeping, we have now muted your microphone, and many thanks for those who did this. If you would like to help with bandwidth in general, it's usually helpful to have the video turned off as well. So if you could turn off your video during the lecture.
Alistair is frozen. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I can.
He'll come back in.
Yeah, I can, but I'm turning myself off.
The opportunity to leave your question in the box, and you will see, and if it isn't the case, make sure that the question goes to everyone, and that way Fiona Sparks, who is our trust manager, who will be monitoring these questions, will pick them up, and as far as time permits, we will have a handful of questions at the end. If we can't get all questions in, I do apologize, but it's a matter of obviously, well, as much as anything, not exhausting our guest speaker, but also it's a matter of time as well. Once you've put your question, you can minimize the chat boxes by clicking the cross on the top right-hand corner of the box. There is a recording of this lecture, which will be sent to you afterwards by way of a link. So everyone who registered will get a link to the recording. And also it will be available, I'm not sure quite when, but sooner rather than later, as a link on our website if you wanted to see this again, or indeed to share it with anybody who you think might be interested. And I'm very grateful for those who are not members of the Friends of the Wellington Trust who've come on. We've spread this far and wide, and I noticed that there are a few of you who actually belong to other organizations that come in. And I will say again how most welcome you are to be here. I wonder, please, if I can have the next slide, Jen. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome John Johnson Allen to give this evening's talk, and he is better qualified than I to say what it's all about. Just a few notes on John. You can see actually a little bit there, but by golly, here we go. John joined BP Tanker Company as a 16-year-old apprentice. And after leaving the sea as a second officer, he entered the property profession. What a wise man, to surveyors at this moment, as an estate agent and auctioneer before specializing as a residential chartered surveyor. His auction experience, for those who are interested in it, was at a firm up in South Yorkshire. He continued, did John, his interest in the sea as a lecturer for the Royal Yachting Association, and he spent 2 years at Lowestoft College and I love this bit, teaching Iranian ex-commandos technical English and seamanship. That was an interesting experience. After retiring, John became an associate member of the Honourable Company of Master Mariners, and he also read for an MA in Maritime History at the Greenwich Maritime Institute. He is now, as very many of you will know, a liveryman of the Honourable Company and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the Royal Institute of Navigation. He is the chairman of the Institute of Seamanship. I must talk to you about that later sometime, John.
Mm-hmm.
Chairman of judging panel for the Mountbatten Maritime Book Award, and a member of the Society for Nautical Research. Now, John lives in a village in Norfolk, which is wonderful. That makes him highly qualified to be in East London. And where he is, and I don't know how he has time to do this as well, chairman of the parish council and a church warden of the local parish church. Now, I think I've said enough. You can see how we couldn't fit that all onto one slide. John, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we go back one, please, Jenny? That's better. Thank you. So, well, as chairman of the Institute of Seamanship, I'm delighted that our annual lecture has not been stopped by the pandemic, and that I have the privilege to deliver this year's lecture to you all. Moving on, the cruise of the Ophir, the Royal Tour of 1901. Well, the Ophir has a very particular connection with the Wellington, as her bell was presented to the Honourable Company by the Orient Line when she came out of service. It is displayed on the half landing, going down from the reception deck to the model deck. And I expect, like me, you've probably walked past it many times without even noticing it. When I was researching for my biography of Rosslyn Wemyss, Jenny, thank you, I found that he was second in command of the Ophir for this cruise at the express request of Prince George, Duke of York. That this request was made was because they had been at Dartmouth together as cadets and then sailed together on their first ship for a 2-year period and became very good friends for the remainder of their lives. In the archives at Churchill College, not only were the papers of Rosslyn Wemyss, but also the papers of Commander Brian Godfrey Fawcett. Oh, come on, what's happening? Who was an aide-de-camp for Prince George for the Royal Tour. He kept a daily journal which ran to over 700 pages for the whole period of the tour. I also found a book written by one of the petty officers on board, Harry Price, of his impressions as a member of the lower deck on the Ophir. The book was illustrated with his own paintings, showing not only places that were visited, but also aspects of life on board, and I've used several to illustrate this talk. After King Edward VII acceded to the throne in 1901, following the death of Queen Victoria, a plan involving Prince George, now Duke of York, which had been in the early stages of planning before the Queen died, resurfaced. It had been agreed that Prince George and Princess Mary should visit Australia to visit the first Parliament of the new Commonwealth. The tour was to take place to visit not just Australia, but 11 other of both the self-governing colonies and colonial possessions ending in Canada, and would take 8 months to complete. Ophir was one of the ships of the Orient Line, which was taken up from trade as none of His Majesty's ships had accommodation which was sufficiently large or comfortable for the royal couple and their extensive entourage. She was one of the company's smaller ships, slightly under 7,000 gross tons, a cargo passenger liner with holds to take refrigerated cargo, and was normally part of the regular Orient Line service to Australia. She did have, as all ships of that company had, very comfortable accommodation, more than sufficient for the royal party. The total number on board, including crew and passengers, was 559, according to the Duke of York. On becoming HMS Ophir, most of her civilian crew were taken off, and the deck and engine room departments replaced by naval personnel. The stewards and cooks, however, were retained, presumably as the standards of Orient Line in that department were more accustomed than those of naval cooks and stewards of that time to the level of service considered necessary. A Royal Marine band was also included as part of the ship's complement. While Rosy was on leave after his appointment as commander of the Niobe, he was sent for by Prince George, who asked for his help in the organization of the tour, and also to become second in command of Ophir, the ship that had been chosen for the purpose. For the time that he was involved in the organization, he was attached to HMS President for special purposes. Rosy's appointment as commander or second in command of the ship was onerous. In addition to the normal role of the commander, who was responsible for the smooth running of the ship on a day-to-day basis, with the exception, of course, of the engine room, including the discipline of the crew and the ongoing maintenance and appearance of the ship, he had the additional responsibility of ensuring that the Duke and Duchess and their entourage were unaffected by the normal working of the ship. Working around the passengers was a normal part of the liner's crew. It was not the function that a naval crew were accustomed to. There were also the pressures of ensuring that the safety and security of the ship was paramount, despite pressures from the journalists who were travelling on the warships escorting Ophir. She arrived at Portsmouth from Tilbury on the 28th of February 1901. There she took on coal bunkers and stores. On the 16th of March, the King and Queen with the Duke and Duchess of York arrived on board. The King inspected the ship, and then the royal group lunched on board with Commodore Winslow, who was the captain of the ship. After lunch at 4:30 p.m, they sailed, steaming out of Portsmouth Harbour, preceded by the Trinity House yacht Galatea, which was followed by the Royal Yacht Alberta, with the King and Queen on board. Crowds had gathered on the shores of the harbour to watch the occasion. Harry Price noted, immense crowds of people lined the shores on both sides, and one could see handkerchiefs waving as far as the eye could reach, while several bands could be heard playing. And above all, the cheers of the multitude, both on shore and on the many boats which accompanied us out of the harbour. They were escorted for the first stage of the tour by HMS's Diadem and Niobe. I'm sorry, the slides seem to be jumping somewhat, Jenny. Can you take me back to? Thank you, that's lovely. I'll move on now. Thank you. HMS's Diadem and Niobe, the latter having been Rosy's last ship. Incidentally, Rosslyn Wemyss, Rosslyn as he was properly known, was known throughout the Navy as Rosy, so that is how I shall refer to him for the rest of the talk. The weather had improved and there was bright sunshine when they arrived at Gibraltar on the 20th of March, so that as they entered port, they passed between two lines of anchored battleships and cruisers, which were dressed overall and with their crews manning their yards. They all fired a 21-gun salute in welcome. Ophir anchored inside the mole, and later in the morning, the Duke and Duchess went ashore in the royal barge, passing between two lines of 12-oared cutters, the crews of which stood bareheaded in their boats, with the officers in charge saluting. They sailed 2 days later for Malta with a new escort, HMS Andromeda and Diana. The short passage to Malta was over on Monday morning, and Ophir was greeted by a squadron of destroyers coming out to meet them and escorting them into port. Commander Godfrey Fawcett described the scene. Our entrance into the harbour was a truly magnificent sight. Practically the whole of the Mediterranean fleet was inside, all dressed with flags, the yards manned, bands playing, men cheering, saluting, crowds of people everywhere on shore, decorations all over the place. He does not, however, note the noise of over 40 warships all flying a 21-gun salute at the same time. In the forenoon, the Governor, Sir Francis Grenfell, the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Sir John Fisher, the Second Admiral, Lord Charles Beresford, and all the other swells, naval and military, came on board and made their bow. They sailed on the 27th of March. Their departure, which was not until midnight, was marked, as Harry Price noted, as the evening drew on by weird-looking craft that began to make their appearance on the water, most of them resembling animals and birds, the best products being a swan and a whale, the elephant, crocodile, sea serpent, lion, and camel all being very good. At 8 p.m., as if by magic, the whole fleet illuminated, and in the background 500 skyrockets descended simultaneously. It was on the water that all eyes were fixed. Apart from the fleet, the Ophir was illuminated. Lined up along both sides of the harbour, outside of the fleet were the destroyers, their searchlights crossing over us and making an archway reaching to the sky. At midnight, a grand salute of 1,000 rockets was a signal for us to depart. Godfrey Fawcett described the spectacle as the most glorious, magnificent, and impressive spectacle I have ever seen or ever will see in this world. It is impossible to give any idea of it. We all got so excited on board here that myself and others climbed up the main rigging, tar, pitch, and all in our best clothes to get a better view, and cheered for all we were worth. I never saw such a sight, and I don't think it will be possible anywhere else but Malta. There is no doubt that the Admiral surpassed even himself in all the arrangements. Ophir's next port of call was Port Said for the transit of the Suez Canal. They arrived in the afternoon and made fast opposite the pilot house. Coal for the bunkers was taken on, which started at 10 p.m, loaded by a local neighbour whose shouts and cries disturbed the sleep of those on board, and was completed about 4 the next morning. 2 hours later, on the 31st of March, she sailed into the Suez Canal. After anchoring in the Bitter Lakes overnight, they passed through Suez in the morning, out into the Red Sea on passage to Aden, arriving there on the 5th of April. Waiting there were the 2 ships that were to be their permanent escorts for the rest of the tour, HMSs Juno and St. George, at anchor off the port. On the evening of the day that they sailed, a dinner for 54 guests was held in the Royal Saloon, which was followed by a reception for about 100 people, the Duke and Duchess shaking hands with all the guests, including many naval officers from the 3 ships. After the reception ended and the officers had returned to their escorts, they and the Ophir sailed at midnight, in Godfrey Fawcett's words, on our way perspiring to Colombo. Whilst on the way to Colombo, Rosy wrote to his friend Lady Constance Butler, HMS Ophir, at sea between Aden and Colombo, April the 6th. We have just left Aden behind and are now steaming along with a smooth sea and a nice breeze on our way to Colombo. So far, our trip has been most successful, though for the first day or 2, the Duchess was horribly ill, but she has been very plucky and I think enjoying herself very much. Yesterday at Aden was the first really very hot day we have had, for we were very lucky in the Red Sea. I had never been to Aden before, and I most sincerely hope that fate may never take me there again. His hope, in fact, was ill-founded, as fate did indeed take him there again. I never saw such a place, and the very sight of it was enough to make one perspire. A dull heat, brown everything. At Gibraltar, we had one shocking bad day, and everything had to be put off, but our reception and send-off from Malta were the 2 finest sights I have ever seen. Our literary people on board said that pen and ink can't describe it properly, so you may imagine I can't. Our party on board are extremely pleasant and good-tempered, and everything shows signs, I hope and think, of the whole trip being most successful. My only curse being the coaling, which you may imagine makes a fine mess of my beautiful white sides. If it weren't for that, I should be quite happy and contented with everything. We are to be 4 days at Colombo, so I'm hoping to get away for a couple of days, for a couple of them, and go up country to Kandy, which I believe is beautiful. They arrived at Colombo on schedule on the 12th of April. The Duke and Duchess had felt the heat of the Indian Ocean. so their visit to the hills above Colombo to Kandy was much anticipated, as it was hoped it would be cooler. However, that didn't prove to be the case. In their absence, the crew were presented with a delivery of fruit, including bananas, pineapples, and mango, which was much appreciated, as it was a considerable rarity in their normal diet. They were also presented with several cases of tea by the local Planters Association. Ophir sailed on the 16th of April on passage to Singapore. Godfrey Fawcett had learnt to play bridge since joining the ship, and on the evening after sailing, he had dinner in the wardroom, followed by bridge, at which he lost, which was not an uncommon occurrence for him. After 5 days at sea, during which time the heat and humidity increased still more, they arrived at Singapore on the 21st and made fast to the coaling wharf. After the Duke and Duchess, with a small party, including Godfrey Fawcett, went off in the royal barge, landing at Johnston Pier, where the official arrival took place, the coaling operation started. On completion in the early evening, she left the wharf and moved out to the man-of-war anchorage, where she remained for the rest of the stay. The next morning, a team of Chinese painters boarded and gave the ship a fresh coat of white paint from stem to stern, which would have been a great pleasure for Rosy, as Ophir's paintwork had become somewhat less pristine than the standard he sought to maintain. On the 23rd, the royal party returned by the royal barge. They sailed at 2 p.m. with their escorts and went full speed for the first 50 miles through the difficult waters of the Malacca Strait, so as to reach open water before nightfall. They were now on passage to Melbourne, and 2 days later they crossed the equator, and King Neptune boarded with his court, making his appearance in a chariot composed of huge seashells, the raw, jagged edges edged in rope that had the appearance of belonging to some ships of a bygone age. The whole lot glided forward, drawn by the guard of honor, composed of the biggest marines in the ship, and dressed in all the outlandish costumes possible. When Neptune, accompanied by his wife and the whole of his court, reached the fore end of the deck, close to the large tank which had been built for the purpose, he was received by their Royal Highnesses the Duke and Duchess. After a few words of greeting, Neptune stepped from his chariot and, carrying a silver goblet in his hand, walked up to the Duchess and sprinkled water on her head, christening her Queen of the Seas. Following that, the main ceremony started, with the Duke first in line, who seated himself in the chair placed at the very edge of the platform overlooking the canvas tank, and was instantly seized by Neptune's barbers and was duly lathered and scraped in the orthodox style, and then pitched head over heels into the water, where he received his baptism at the hands of the sea bears in the tank, who gave him a severe ducking amid the laughter of the Duchess and suite and the whole of the assembled ship's company. The first stop in Australia was to be Albany, for the escorts to take on coal bunkers, as they were at the limits of their range and had needed to reduce speed to reserve coal stocks. The next entry in Rosy's letter to Lady Constance Butler added, "We're due to arrive at Albany tonight. The concert came off last night, and in spite of the ship's rolling, I danced. One or two of the men on board here are really extraordinarily talented in various ways, and we got up some quite good entertainments. I'm now trying to organize some tableaux, but it is difficult. We are well out of the heat now, and today is the first full day for a long time we haven't seen the sun. I have again missed seeing my tulips and daffodils at Mainsail Hall, which is a great disappointment. This was a property he'd rented on the Hamble while he was a lieutenant serving on one of the royal yachts. The concert in the Royal Saloon was with a cast which included Rosy, who did a sword dance, which he managed with great skill as the ship was rolling and pitching heavily. Ophir arrived at Melbourne on the 6th of May and anchored off the city. After lunch, the royal party left the ship in Hygeia, an elegant paddle steamer which had come out to collect them, to land at St Kilda Pier to the accompaniment of 21-gun salutes from the warships at anchor. Godfrey Fawcett described the scene. Each of the carriages was drawn by 4 horses with postilions, 2 footmen behind, and all in powdered wigs. Exceedingly smart it was, and also beautifully turned out, beautiful horses. Lord Hopetown, the Governor-General, has no equal where horses and carriages are concerned. The procession was a very long one, over a distance of 7 miles through the town. The crowds were enormous and most enthusiastic, the streets simply lined with stands and all overflowing with people, besides those who stood in the streets and at the windows, etc. The triumphal arches were magnificent works of art. They must have cost thousands of pounds, and they were very numerous. Bunting, decorations, Venetian masts everywhere. The whole of the route, 7 miles, was lined with these Venetian masts on either side at about 30 yards apart, and each one cost over £4. The huge arch and pillars on Princess Bridge cost a sum of £8,000. The whole cost of the decorations, illuminations, and all the rest of it that was done in the city in honour of the royal visit was over £110,000, and that relates to £13.5 million in today's rates. I had no idea that Melbourne was such a huge town, nor did I think any city in the colonies contained so many splendid buildings. It opened my eyes considerably. The processing around the town lasted for over 2 hours, and it was 4:30 before we found ourselves at Government House. Their Royal Highnesses rather tired, I think, after the strain of it all. In the afternoon, Ophir, together with Juno and St. George, went alongside one of the piers to take on coal the next day. The crew were allowed leave, and half the ship's company, the port watch, went off on 60 hours leave, after which the starboard watch had their 60 hours ashore, so that they too, in addition to the normal distractions of a jack ashore, could enjoy the decorations in the town. They went by train to Melbourne from the port and were delighted that they were allowed to travel free of charge. After both watches had returned, having been warmly welcomed by the people, some of whom would no doubt have enthusiastically helped them in their distractions, the ship was open to the public. She was boarded by huge crowds in the best of spirits. The crew had some difficulty in persuading the crowds to leave in the evening, and many stayed on the pier. They were then to see at 8 p.m. the dazzling spectacle of all the warships illuminated. 2 days later, the whole reason for the visit to Australia came to pass, the opening of the first Commonwealth Parliament. The royal procession went from Government House to the exhibition buildings, where the ceremony was to take place. 13,000 people were crammed into the space, with at one end a huge dais on which the Duke and Duchess, the Governor-General and his wife, with, behind them, the governors of all the Australian states and various officials. The day after the opening, there was a review at Flemington Racecourse, where nearly 15,000 troops went by, including a naval brigade of 1,000 sailors and 300 marines. It was estimated that it was watched by over 100,000 people. After sailing from Melbourne, Rosy wrote to Lady Constance Butler with his impressions of the visit. HMS Ophir, at sea between Melbourne and Sydney, May the 19th. I must confess I'm getting a little tired of seeing every place en fete, and amongst the drawbacks is the fact it's very difficult to get one's washing done, as the washerwomen, like everybody else, are having a holiday while we're in port. Whilst in Melbourne, we threw the ship open to visitors for 2 days from 1 to 5 p.m. And during those hours on the first day, it was calculated that over 12,000 people came on board, and rather more the next day. And the surprising part is that they knew they could only see very little, was of course all the cabins etc. were locked up. Otherwise, I think there would have been little or no furniture left. We had great luck with our weather. May it long continue. Lady Catty, that's Lady Catherine Cook, and Bridget, that's Mrs. Derek Keppel, are on board with us. So last night we danced and had great fun. I have brought a cockatoo, which I'm trying to learn to talk. At present, the only results are awful screeches and some bites in the hand, but I suppose that patience will do something eventually. Ophir arrived at Sydney on the 20th, from where the royal party went by train to Brisbane. As there had been an outbreak of the plague in Brisbane, if Ophir had gone there, she would have been detained in quarantine, and the timings of the remainder of the tour would have been severely affected. The royal party arrived back from Brisbane on the 25th, the day before the Duchess's birthday, which was celebrated on board in great style, including the crew being given a special tot of rum, in which they were joined by the Duke and Duchess. On the next morning, Ophir and her two escorts, Juno and St George, steamed through Port Jackson Heads into Sydney Harbour, escorted by the Australian squadron to anchor in Farm Cove opposite Government House. In the afternoon, the royal couple went ashore in the royal barge, which had been brought round from Melbourne for their formal welcome to Sydney. Godfrey Fawcett noted that the decorations were very good indeed, but not quite so elaborate a scale as Melbourne. The royal visit ended on the 6th, when the Duke and Duchess returned on board and the three ships steamed out of port to find it blowing hard, causing the ship to roll and pitch considerably and the Duchess to retire to her cabin. They were now on passage for New Zealand. The passage to Auckland in the north of the North Island was not pleasant, as the weather conditions were poor for the whole distance and the sea was very rough. They arrived on the 10th, but first anchored off Devonport to wait for the next day for the official arrival. Whilst at anchor, Harry Price relates, "Here we witnessed quite a unique incident, i.e., we perceived a small boat making for the ship, and as it got closer, we saw that a little girl was the sole occupant. She was a white girl and no older than 10 years at the outside. She pulled beautifully, came up alongside in grand style, although a nasty sea was running. One of the side boys went down the gangway to meet her, and she gave him a beautiful bouquet and asked him to give it to the Duchess. Needless to say, it was accepted." By the next morning, the weather had improved, as Ophir made her way with her escort into Auckland for the official arrival. 2 days after their arrival, the royal party and some officials from the three ships, including Rosy, went by special train to Rotorua, some 130 miles south of Auckland. They saw the hot springs, some spouting up to 50 feet high, that's 15 meters, of boiling water. Godfrey Fawcett and Rosy returned later to sit in one of the hot water pools, lazing for half an hour before returning for dinner at the Giza Hotel. After dinner, they watched a haka dance given by 5 Maori girls, 4 of whom Godfrey Fawcett noted were quite good looking, before walking back 3 miles to Rotorua in the dark over a bad road. From Auckland, they sailed on to Wellington and then to Lyttelton, the port for Christchurch, from where the royal party took the train to Dunedin. Ophir sailed round to Dunedin near the southern end of the South Island, where the royal party returned to her, where she was at anchor by tug. She was rolling heavily in the swell, so the process of boarding was, although perilous, eventually completed without problem. Although the tug caused considerable damage to the accommodation ladder and other external fittings, so Commodore Winslow ordered the tug to move away so the luggage could be transferred using Ophir's boats. Once all had been boarded, she sailed for Hobart. Once she had cleared the south coast, the conditions deteriorated further, and Ophir was rolling and pitching heavily, shipping water on board. Harry Price recollected, "I think the bakehouse suffered the most. I looked in and found the poor baker up to his waist in water, with loaves of bread, buns, dough, bags of flour, dishes, baking tins, all floating around. Several men have been injured, and the Duchess must have been very ill." The poor conditions at sea had continued both on the trip to Hobart and from there on the next leg. So, arriving off Port Adelaide, they found there was too much wind for the Ophir to go over the bar and up the river. So they anchored, and the royal party transferred to a local vessel for their arrival, followed the next day when the conditions had eased by Ophir. During their stay, the ship's band gave 3 concerts, and Ophir again welcomed the public on board. Harry Price believed in greater numbers than anywhere else they had been. Much of Ophir's time there was taken up by the bane of Rosy's life, coaling. And that's what it was really like, filling the bunkers with nearly 1,500 tons of coal, creating clouds of coal dust which settled everywhere, and which all had to be cleaned away before the royal party returned. The day of departure from Australia was the 26th of July, when at 3 p.m. they sailed from Fremantle on course for the long voyage across the Indian Ocean to Mauritius with a relay of escorts, as the cruiser's range wasn't adequate for the complete passage at Ophir's cruising speed. Rosy continued his correspondence to Constance Butler. HMS Ophir, August 11th. Australia is finished, for which many thanks, and also Mauritius, and we are due at Durban tomorrow night, and I'm quite excited as I hope to see Randolph. That was his eldest brother, as I haven't seen him for over 2 years, nor did he get to see him then, because Randolph had left by that time. We had a tremendous send-off from Fremantle, our last Australian place. It was a good place for a send-off, as we had to steam about half a mile quite close to quays, which were thronged with enthusiastic crowds. HRH stood up on the bridge and gave 3 cheers for Australia. He has a capital voice and it must have been heard by thousands. And how the people did shout. I didn't manage to get ashore at Mauritius, as I was too busy on board and so saw nothing of the island, for which I'm sorry. Guess what? Rosy's time at Mauritius was taken up with the coaling procedure and cleaning the ship afterwards. He continued, Simon's Bay, August the 21st. We got here 2 days ago and I've been coaling ever since. How I loathe the very word coal. It plays the deuce with the appearance of the ship, and I always have so little time to do it in. We leave here the day after tomorrow and get to Quebec on September the 15th, and then a good month's peace, and then home. I must say I shall be glad to get home. A most interesting and enjoyable cruise it has been, but I shan't be sorry when it's all over. They sailed from Simon's Bay on the 23rd of August. Bound for St. Vincent in the Caribbean to take on cold before sailing for Quebec. The temperatures rose as they sailed towards the tropics, and Godfrey Fawcett was rather anxious about our shirts. No washing done on shore since we were in Perth in July, and then very little on board. The capabilities of the ship's laundry are very limited indeed, and if one succeeds in getting 4 shirts washed in a fortnight, one is lucky. And such were the cares of an aide-de-camp. Whilst at sea, the crew were regularly exercised at physical drill. And Harry Price noted, our commander was a regular school of physical culture and never seemed so happy as when he had charge of the drill, and especially so when he ordered knees up. Coaling and cleaning completed in St. Vincent, she sailed soon after 4 p.m, leaving behind her escorts Juno and St. George for the voyage north up the eastern coast of North America to Quebec, on the St. Lawrence River in Canada. They reached Canadian waters on the 13th of September and were met by 2 ships of the North American Squadron, HMSs Indefatigable and Tribune, carrying mail from Canada, and also, a French-Canadian pilot who would take them up the St. Lawrence River. During the next morning, HMS Quail, a torpedo boat destroyer, the predecessor of an destroyer as we know it, came out to Ophir to collect dispatches. To save time, it was decided to rig a boom out from the Ophir's side for Quail to collect the bag from the end of the boom, whilst both were steaming at 15 knots. The lieutenant in command of Quail misjudged his approach and colliding with the Ophir's starboard bow before her speed enabled her to pull clear from a considerable risk of being run down, crossing close ahead, making, in Godfrey Fawcett's words, an extraordinarily narrow escape by a few inches only. Later that morning, Ophir, followed by 4 escorting cruisers, arrived off Quebec, mooring to a buoy in the river. At noon, the Duke and Duchess landed in Quebec to be taken in a carriage procession to Government House. Godfrey Fawcett again. The steepness of the hills in the town of Quebec is terrible. It is difficult to understand how heavy carriages can be got up, some of them. The royal carriage was a monster, one of the royal posting or town coaches, I think they call them, sent out from Buckingham Palace on purpose for their Royal Highness's visit. It was drawn by 4 horses and postilions. The royal party left the ship on the 18th to join the royal train for their tour of Canada, which was to last a month, crossing Canada, eventually arriving at Vancouver before returning to Halifax. Amongst many other places they were to visit were Montreal, Ottawa, Winnipeg, Toronto, Niagara, and St. John before arriving at Halifax to rejoin Ophir for the return to England. From Quebec, she had steamed round to Halifax. On her arrival, Rosy was able to set the crew to work, scraping, removing rust, and applying red lead paint where appropriate. After the first day of preparation of the upper works, she moved into dry dock, and as the water drained out of the dock, the crew, standing on floating pontoons, were cleaning the underwater parts as the level descended, and then they painted the bottom with anti-fouling. When that was completed, she moved out of the dock the next morning. The crew were given 3 days' leave by watchers, the starboard watch going first. After the leave period, she then moved, wait for it, to the coaling wharf, and with the help of sailors from the escorts, a large heap of coal was moved to the bunkers, followed naturally by cleaning thoroughly all the new paint, which had been coated in coal dust. They sailed from Halifax in bad weather and a snowstorm, escorted by a Niobean diadem, which had rejoined them for the last leg, with a further escort of 6 ships of the North American Squadron to take them out of harbour. Before finally leaving Canada, they called at St. John's in Newfoundland. During the passage there, Prince George invited Rosy to become an extra equerry, an honorary post, which he accepted with great enthusiasm. After 2 days at St. John's, they sailed at 7 a.m. so as to clear the Grand Banks early in the afternoon. They were now on passage home. Harry Price's journal for their departure day is headed "Homeward Bound," and he noted, "All the men were in great glee at the prospect of soon being in Old England. Portsmouth was looked forward to with more interest than any place we had been to yet, and sea songs, mostly about going home, were the order of the day and night, rolling home to merry England being the favourite." Harry Price noted the track and the ports they had called at in his journal. In the same vein, Godfrey Fawcett noted the distances he had travelled since sailing from Portsmouth, as, on Ophir, 45,657 miles, and by train, 12,295 miles. He also noted that the royal couple, at public receptions only, had shaken hands with 24,835 people. On the 30th of October, the smoke of the ships of the Channel Fleet could be seen in the distance. As they approached, it could be seen that it consisted of 6 battleships and 7 cruisers, the latter including Ophir's escort for much of the tour, St. George and Juno. The following day, they arrived in the Solent and anchored in Yarmouth Roads. At 5 in the evening, the entire suite, the ship's officers and the ship's company were individually presented with a commemorative medallion by the Duke and Duchess. Those of the members of the suite, Commodore Winslow and Rosy's, were of gold, and the remainder, hello, what's happening here? Go, thank you. Were of gold, and the remainder were of silver. On the 1st of November, the Trinity House yacht Galatea, we're going mad, escorted by the Royal Yachts, HMSs Victoria and Albert, Osborne and Alberta, followed by Ophir, and soon after lunch, we proceeded up harbour, preceded by the Victoria and Albert, passed through the fleet, anchored at Spithead, the ships being manned. A great reception as we went up harbour, Southsea Beach and all the way along, black with people who waved and cheered. After they'd arrived alongside, during the afternoon, the King and Queen came on board Ophir to be greeted by the royal suite and the ship's company, all drawn up on deck to receive them. In the evening, there was a dinner party on board the Victoria and Albert, including the royal family, from the Ophir, where the Royal Highnesses, the Duke and Duchess, and the royal suite, Commodore Winslow and Rosy. Other guests included all the Lords of the Admiralty, led by the First Lord, Lord Selborne. The return home for the royal couple was greeted with relief. That the tour was widely seen as a success, and thank God that the tour has gone off so well. The success of the tour was in no small part due to the efforts of Rosslyn Wemyss. He was rewarded by promotion to captain and receiving the MVO from the hands of the King. And there he is, as he is. And lastly, but by no means least, the last slide is the front cover of my new book, which I hope you'll all make a note of. Thank you very much indeed. Now moved out.
There we are. John, that was a fantastic talk. I saw about a third of it because I had one of these wonderful Zoom experiences of dropping out spontaneously. And it took me about 15, 20 minutes to get back in again.
Oh dear.
I'm very glad you didn't notice I wasn't there because you might have been roundly put off, John.
I was so concentrating, I didn't notice a thing, Alistair.
Well, bless your heart. Thank you so much indeed. It was fascinating, and I'm looking forward to hearing the full recording of this afterwards. As I was saying earlier on and intimating, we had the rehearsal the other day, and we went through your slides, and it was quite fascinating. What it really brings home to me is what a difference there is between the Royal Navy today and the Royal Navy then, and indeed the Royal Navy in the time when amongst others here, Stephen Taylor and I and Angus were serving as well. I mean, in terms of the hardware, that painting of the fleet coming out with 7 battleships to come and meet the royal vessel as it came back, or for the then royal vessel when it came back into harbour, was just quite remarkable. I just want to slightly pick up on that one, because how many royal yachts were there?
There were 3. There was the Victorian Albert, the Osborne and Alberta. And in his early career, Rosy had served on both the Victorian Albert and the Osborne.
Interesting indeed. And I think you were telling, and forgive me if you mentioned this in your lecture just now when I was away, but is it right that as an ex-merchantman or as a merchantman, the Ophir was chosen because of the ability to produce these wonderful opulent suites for the royal family, or for the royal couple rather?
That was, she was a standard one of a class, of the 7,000 ton class, and there were, I think, probably a couple of others like her, and that was for fairly standard, I think, with the first class of accommodation for an Orient liner at the time. Good
heavens, that's remarkable. Well, I mean, such ships never to be seen again, I think, is the answer. Well, not in that way.
Well, no, certainly we have blocks of flats afloat these days.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing is, and again, you may have mentioned it, forgive me if I've missed it, but who did the paintings and where are they kept?
The paintings were all done by Harry Price, who I mentioned. He produced, his journal was published as a facsimile book many years ago, and I happened to find a copy and was able to use some of his illustrations out of that facsimile book. I think it's I can't remember the precise name, it's not in front of me at the moment. It's something like the Royal Tour or the Cruise of the Ophir or something like that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your preparation for coming tonight on and talking to us. Now, if Fiona has not had the same technical problems I have, hopefully, Fiona, you will have collected a few questions there. And I wonder whether, John, you'd be happy to answer 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 questions, depending on how much time we have. It's now 17 minutes past 7.
However many there are, I'm happy to answer if I can.
That's really good of you. Let's bring them on. Now, Fee, over to you, if I may. And for the moment, I will go mute. I'm very pleased to say.
Well, I think before, John, you said that you were going to be very thorough. And I think you've answered most people's questions.
Oh, good.
We've had a lot of most interesting. Right, here's one from Holly from Kenosha in USA. Thank you for a most interesting talk. It's fortunate that Royal Tour took place in 1901, 14 years before World War I. We all know what happens after 1914. Right, I actually had one, John. Are we able to order your book?
Yes, indeed you are. You can order it from either local bookshops or direct from Whittles Publishing, and their email is info@whittlespublishing.com. I just happen to have that in the top of my brain. I can't think why. And I imagine later on it'll probably become available on Amazon as well. But yes, it's available to order now.
Fantastic. Christmas is coming.
Indeed, it is. Sadly, it won't actually be published until next year, the spring of next year, but you can certainly order it now.
Fantastic. And what happened to Ophir?
She went back into service as an Orient liner, and it was when she was withdrawn from service and sent to scrap that her bell arrived on the Wellington.
Fantastic. Right. Well, unless anybody else has anything else that they'd like to ask.
Well, others will know the answer to this, and I don't know. How long ago was that the Wellington had the Ophir? Was it from the start? Of
She was presented in 1930. The bell was presented in 1930.
Fantastic. About the time that it became the Honourable Company, or just before?
2 years after, I think, actually.
2 years after, right? Indeed.
Yeah.
Fantastic. That's good. Fiona, are there any further questions?
There are. Yeah, Alistair.
Yes, Stephen. You're
just
live.
a quickie to John.
Yep.
Hello, Stephen.
Evening, John. Have you been in touch with any of the Wemysses still around?
Indeed, I have.
I think I served with 2 of them.
Now then. Now that Alistair's also already brought this up.
Whiskey Wemyss.
Yes, that is the other branch of the Wemyss family. There's 2 branches. There's the branch at which Rosy Wemyss is part of, whose ancestral home is Wemyss Castle on the Firth of Forth. The branch of the family that you served with are from Castle Wemyss, and they're the senior branch, and the Earl of Wemyss is the head of that bit of the clan. The cadet branch is headed by Michael Wemyss, who lives in Wemyss Castle. And Claire and I actually went up to have lunch with them and look over the castle and the private graveyard, so I could see where Rosy was buried.
Is whiskey still around?
I have no idea. I don't know anything about that side of the family at all, I'm afraid, Stephen.
Okay.
He was a lovely man. He also, Stephen, you'll remember this because you and I were both fishmen, weren't we? Fish boats.
Yes.
6 MCM.
With the French.
Yeah. And yes, exactly. We're going to be called back. You realise that?
Yeah.
Stephen? Go bull your boots, will you? Let's get this all together. Whiskey Wemyss used to be on the jetty. He was the captain at HMS Lochinvar. I think he was right. He was the captain. And he was the most delightful man, but I also remember ill-fitting uniform, never quite looked quite right on him. But he actually lived in an enormous house. And John, since we spoke about this last week, I did some research and I found where he wasn't. It wasn't Wemyss Castle, of course. He lived in Dundas Castle, which was up the hill behind South Queensferry, which is a very lovely pile, now open for wedding venues, etc., with a golf course. And we played a very sort of unkempt golf course occasionally. We were taken up there by our skipper to play, and now it's a rather swept up sort of professional golf course, I think. So there we are. So that's the Wemyss connection. Yeah. Now Stephen has opened the batting. Fee, have you got any more questions?
Yes, a couple more have come in.
Okay, good.
Who was Lady Constance?
You're right. Lady Constance Butler was a friend of Rosy's. Now, how they actually met, I haven't been able to find out. But when Rosy, I mentioned Mainsell Hall, the house he rented in the Hamble, and he did a lot of sailing, racing sailing in the Solent in the half-deckers. And so did Lady Constance Butler, and I suspect they may have met then. She was one of the great beauties of the age. A remarkable lady. She served as a nurse throughout the First World War. She never married, and she was still nursing through the Second World War. But I say how they actually met, I know no more about her, I'm afraid. But if you put her into Google, you'll find pictures of her. She's quite stunning.
Excellent. We have a message from the northeast of Scotland Outport, thanking you for a very interesting presentation. And another question, what year and where was Ophir built?
I'm afraid I have no idea. Sorry about that. Not a clue. Oh, I know she wasn't. She was only about a couple of years old when she was taken up from trade. So let's say about 1907, 1908. But where she was built, I'm afraid I have no idea at all.
Okay.
Now,
Right.
are there any other questions there, Fiona?
I think
There's something from John Hasselgren I can see.
Oh, you have raised two memories for me.
John, I'm afraid I cannot type fast.
Oh, John, would you
Hello,
like to give
John.
your question in person? Good to hear you.
You've raised a couple of things which intrigue me. Firstly, the collision between Ophir and Quail.
Yes.
Delivery of dispatches.
So say again, the last bit.
Sorry, John.
Can you repeat the last bit, John, please?
Yes, the delivery of dispatches between Ophir and Quail and the collision.
Yes.
It reminds me that many, many years ago, in the late 1950s, I was postman, or one of the postmen, of the 3rd Submarine Squadron, and had to deliver mail at sea to a submarine that we'd rendezvoused with, which we actually did by a heaving line, because the submarine did not have a very large bag of mail. A relatively small crew. We put a heaving line to her, put the bag of mail on the end of the heaving line, put another heaving line on that, and they hauled it on board. So we did it without a collision.
But did the mail stay dry though?
Sorry, John?
Did the mail stay dry?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We were much higher than them.
Oh, right.
The other thing is, your book is The Man Who Invented Remembrance Day.
No, the man who created Remembrance Day. Oh, Armistice Day, to be perfectly correct. Armistice, not remembrance.
I have a feeling that somewhere at the back of my mind, I have the thought that at the armistice in 1918, the Second Sea Lord was sent as one of the Allied delegates and had been instructed by the Prime Minister to arrange the armistice for 1430.
Well,
Obeyed orders because he said 1430 1111 is not very poetic, and by going for 11 11 11 I've saved several thousand lives. As a result, he did not get a peerage or the grant of money that all the other Allied commanders received. Was that this man?
indeed it was, John, yes. Actually, Admiral Hope was the second, Rosy's deputy, who came with him. Yes, indeed. And Rosy and Marshal Foch were dealing with the last points of settling the points with the Germans from 2 o'clock on the morning of the 11th until 5:30, when everything was agreed. And that was when the 11th of the 11th of the 11th came up at Rosy's idea, backed up by Marshal Foch. And then from after that it all stopped. Then Rosy and Foch went down to Paris to meet Clemenceau, and Rosy actually then telephoned the government to let them know what had happened, and he might have got away with it, except he also phoned the king. Of course, as you heard, he was a great friend of the king, so he phoned his monarch to let him know. The king told the court, and the court told everybody else, so everything came out. So that was why Rosy did not get the peerage. He did not get the huge grant that Haig and Jellicoe and so forth got. He was instead of £100,000, he was given £10,000, which was a huge injustice.
Yeah, in some ways it seems reminiscent of Bomber Harris in the Second World War as well, doesn't it?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Except, yeah, I suppose.
Can I just pick up a note that went past John from Malcolm Parrott, and thank you, Malcolm, very much for this, that the Ophir was built in Glasgow in 1891 and was scrapped in Troon in 1921.
Oh, thank you,
30
Malcolm.
years. Useful information. Fee, I think you would have seen there was a message came up from Flavian, I
I
think.
did, yes. From what you told us, there was no air cooling on board, even in first class.
No, there wasn't. It was
Uncle Wallace.
1901, Flavian. There's no air conditioning in those days. They all sweated like everybody else.
With a stiff shirt and with a tight waist, so that must be very difficult for the male and the female of the species.
Quite, yes. And
Yeah,
the problems with laundry as well, having a suitable supply of white shirts.
yeah. Dobie was kept very busy, I think, in those days.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. Fee, are there any more questions? If John still has the appetite for maybe one more question.
No, absolutely.
I don't believe.
I have one. Howard.
Howard, come up. Yeah.
Yeah. The collision with HMS Quail, the painting, if it's a painting that was done by a witness, is absolutely horrific, because if one studies the reports of collisions and groundings of the Royal Navy, going back at least 120 years, there have been a large number of collisions between ships trying to pick up mail from larger ships. And the wisdom, the actual instructions as to what to do if you are in the position that Quail was in, is that you should immediately stop both engines and let the ship bang back alongside the larger ship and go clear astern, slightly scratched but unscathed. The last occasion that I'm aware that this happened was when HMS Fittleton was trying to pick up mail from HMS Mermaid, and I was astern in the next minesweeper. I had the evening before given the engine room branch of the minesweeper squadron a report, because we knew we were going to pick up mail from Mermaid. We knew that Mermaid had a strange structure and we had to be very far forward to be able to get to the wash deck. And I had warned the engine room branch, who always had a man on the bridge of the minesweepers at that time, that if any of our ships got into that position, they should immediately slam both throttles down. Fittleton did exactly the opposite and did apparently what HMS Quail did, tried to power ahead, and Quail was extremely lucky not to go under the bow of Ophir and be cut in two, I suggest.
Oh, she was very lucky. The painting, of course, was done by Harry Price, who was on Ophir at the time. So it was an imaginary painting, you might say, for using his skill just to produce an image, a painting of the occurrence. No, I think the Quail was extremely lucky. But I don't know what the speed those first TBDs could do, but probably could accelerate from 15 knots pretty quickly, and indeed must have done so, disregarding any instructions there might have been in the books to the contrary.
Yeah, exactly. The canal effect just sucks the smaller ship in under the bow of the bigger ship.
Oh, yes.
Rolls it around, and that's exactly what happened to Fittleton.
It was tragic. I remember that. Loss of life as well, I think, as well.
Yes, yeah. I dived on her, and there were 8 people alive on board when I dived on her.
Oh, gosh.
That's awful, awful, awful. Thank you very much indeed for that, Howard. Fee, have you anything else that's come up on the system?
No other questions, just one comment from Melvin Newell. Wonderful. I feel as if I've been round the world.
Thank you, Melvin.
Well, I certainly have been trying to get back on screen again, but there we are. And I use that as the opportunity, John, to thank you once again for your fascinating talk. Fascinating as much as anything, because, as I said, it took us back into an era that we can't believe that that's the way that things were done. But those days it would have been regarded as the norm. What an incredible story. And I can only wish you good luck with the sale of your book. And I look forward to reading it and to also hearing the full lecture when I get the link back again.
Well, I
I'm very grateful to you. I hope you'll relax. I've got my whiskey here to toast you. Very good, Slant.
Thank you.
And you can now revert to your red wine. I think that probably, if I might suggest, probably, except I'm going to hand back to Jennifer to give the news of somebody who is sitting here in the second row on my screen, who's going to be giving the lecture next month. Jenny, over to you.
And there he is, Richard Shuttleworth. Thank you for joining us, Richard. Here's the promotion for your next lecture, January the 11th, 2021. The Battle of Taranto, 11th of November, 1940. And we'll be sending you details in due course and hope you'll be able to join us. And here's the plug. Thank you for those of you who have made a donation towards the preservation of the Wellington and the running of the ship. We do appreciate it, and we put the money to very good use. So watch your inboxes for a recording of this lecture, and also for the invitation to join Richard on the 11th of January.
Sorry, I was late.
No, you're all welcome.
I organised the Zoom one at 6 o'clock, and Alan West was our speaker. So,
oh no, you got to
organised. I didn't really miss it. Quite interesting.
Look, thank you very much indeed. I think that probably, well, I was going to say the formal part of the evening is not formal. It's been wonderfully informal, or what I saw of it. But if you would like to turn on, converse, stay, chat, talk, whatever, sharing a whiskey, this is now the moment to do it. Thank you all very much for coming.
Yes,
and John,
please.
especially for you.
Thank you, Matt.
Cheers, John.